history of boarding schools here in the United States and Canada. My name is Ray Burns. I'm the Vice President of Student Success at Red Lake Nation College. And again, I'd like to welcome both here in the audience, in our overflow room, and everyone online right now who's watching. And just a little brief overview, please, everyone here, please make sure you have your phones off or on mute. If you're at home, don't worry about it. But we do also have everyone's on universal mute, so you can talk everything at home and we won't hear anything on Facebook. And if you have any comments, questions, don't hesitate to use the Facebook chat feature, and we'll be asking questions here in the audience and from our overflow room as well. We also have a YouTube channel if the Facebook channel isn't quite working, and we will post that link in our chat as well. So if you're not quite, Facebook isn't quite working, you can go to YouTube and look as well. Just a couple of things to start off with. Again, Red Lake Nation College. One of the things that we are celebrating is that we did receive our accreditation from the Higher Learning Commission in February of 2021. It was a 10-year process, but we are accredited. And with that accreditation, we are also the same accreditation that University of Minnesota, Bemidji State University, Notre Dame, all those other institutions of higher education, we're on the same pedestal they are. So we're very proud of that and the hard work that it took to get that done. And one of the things that we're really excited about is we are now offering classes here in Minneapolis at the Red Lake Nation Embassy. It is an opportunity for people here in the Minneapolis area to engage with the Red Lake culture and language and Ojibwe language and culture in a way that's not offered anywhere else. And we're very proud of having this classes here. And we're also very proud of what we do at Red Lake Nation College in terms of embracing every student and staff and faculty. We're all family here, and we want to extend that to our family down here in Minneapolis. So please check that out. And also, this is part of our community education and outreach. So we'll be holding events like this, presentations, and things like that that will respond to the community. So if you have ideas of things that you might want to see the college do, please don't hesitate to contact us, and we'll try to work that out for you. And as I said, this is a very hot topic right now, very important topic on boarding schools and what education, Indigenous education means to Indian people. So it's very, we're very glad to have our distinguished guest speaker here. And so with that, to introduce our speaker, the chair of the Board of Regents for Red Lake Nation College, I'd like to bring up Lorena Cook.
Thank you, Mr. Burns. Bonjour, Anine, welcome everybody. It is my honor to introduce the speaker for this evening and my great friend, Brenda Child. Brenda, Red Lake Ojibwe, is Northrop professor and former chair of the Departments of American Studies and American Indian Studies at the University of Minnesota. She is a past president of the Native American and Indigenous Studies Association in 2017-18 and was a member of that council from 2016 to 2019. Just this past spring of 2021, Brenda was the University of Minnesota's recipient of the President's Community Engaged Scholar Award. Brenda Child holds a PhD in history and is the author of several award-winning books, including Boarding School Seasons, American Indian Families, 1900 to 1940, Holding Our World Together, Ojibwe Women and the Survival of Community, and My Grandfather's Knocking Sticks, Ojibwe Family Life and Labor on the Reservation. That book won the American Indian Book Award. Her new book project, The Marriage Blanket, Love, Violence, and the Law in Indian Country, is a historical study of domestic violence, disenrollment, and changes in family life on the reservation. In 2018, Brenda was inducted into the Professional Education Hall of Fame at Bemidji State University, where she received her undergraduate degree. At Red Lake, she has been part of the Constitutional Reform Initiative of our tribe. In 2019, she curated an exhibit at the Mille Lacs Indian Museum in central Minnesota, The Jingle Dress at 100. She is the author of a bilingual prize-winning book for children, Bow Wow Powwow. It won a major prize, the American Indian Youth Literature Medal. His a popular new documentary, Jingle Dress Dancers in the Modern World, Ojibwe People and Pandemics. Child scholarship focuses on gender, labor, and family life in the Great Lakes and the history of Indigenous education. She is married to Mille Lacs Ojibwe artist Steve Primo, and they live with their family in St. Paul and Bemidji, Minnesota. My distinct honor and pleasure, Brenda, to introduce you.
As Lorena was introducing me, I was thinking, reflecting back on our work over the last, how many years it's been, 7 years or more, working on the Constitution Reform Initiative at Red Lake, which was a real pleasure in a lot of ways, because I came to really appreciate how much Red Lake history Lorena knows. And a lot of it is through understanding family relationships and complicated histories in our communities, but it really was great. And the other thing I would mention too about Lorena is that a few years ago, I wanted to start looking into our own archives on the reservation to understand more about issues that I ended up writing about in this book that I'm currently working on about the history of American Indian marriage. And Lorena sat with me in the archives and helped me digitize a lot of our Red Lake archives. And it was so great because, again, if I would say, well, who was this? Someone who lived in the 1940s, she would say, oh yeah, that was this, and their mother was this, married to this person, and their families, So you always get the big picture of families when you spend time with Lorena. So I always think how fortunate the Tribal College is as well to have such a distinguished Red Lake tribal member as the chair of their board. So when I was talking about boarding school last week, what I tried to do was kind of think about the big questions that many of us have about boarding school history. And I think I eventually came up with about 7 questions. And I asked things like, and try to answer, when was the boarding school era? How many schools were there in Minnesota in particular? What were the differences, major differences between Indian education in the United States and Canada? Did children die at school? Were there cemeteries? So some of these big questions I tried to address last week, and I may repeat some of them with my presentation, but I think that I want to kind of end up maybe on a little bit different note. Last week you can scroll through the first few, these were things we talked about already, and just maybe leave it here on the letter. But last week I was trying to look at some of those big issues. And I also introduced this idea that we should probably think about boarding schools in terms of generations, that there was something very unique about the first generation of American Indians who attended federal boarding schools at the end of the Indian Wars. And they had an experience that wasn't entirely shared with other generations of American Indians. But tonight what I'm going to do is also kind of extend that conversation to think about the question of child removal and family separation in American history that kind of extends the boarding school story beyond just where I kind of end up in my book, Boarding School Seasons, which is at the end of the Great Depression, to think about issues that were particular to American Indian history and American Indian life at that time, to sort of go on to give you a little overview anyway of what some of the issues have been in family separation in more recent decades. And I think last week I ended with this letter from my great-grandfather, David Jones, who himself had attended Carlisle as a youth, and then later sent his own daughter, my grandmother Jeanette, to a boarding school at Flandreau, South Dakota in the early 1920s. And I think I mentioned last week that the first time I saw my grandfather's handwriting was when I came across this letter, which was actually in the National Archives. And this was, I think, in my grandmother's, I don't know, I think it was in the general files of Flandreau. And there was also a letter in there that we I made a copy of course, and distributed it to my family members at the time. And it was a letter my grandmother had written herself when she came back to Red Lake. And apparently some of her belongings were still at the boarding school. And she had a black trunk that she was requesting the superintendent send on to her at Redby. So I saw Grandma's handwriting. Of course, I knew Grandma's handwriting because she was a big letter writer, and I was familiar with that. But I had never seen my grandpa, David Jones was his English name since Carlisle. I had never seen his handwriting before this letter. And so I guess my point is to say about this history that for American Indian people, you can look and think, oh, this is a historical era. It happened a long time ago. But we know that this history happened to our families. We heard about it first in our own families, most of us, before we ever read a history book or read a newspaper story. And, I've been kind of impressed with the last week NBC News, the PBS NewsHour. Everybody has been talking about Indian boarding schools in the last month. And what bothers me, I guess, as a scholar, is that there's a lot of misinformation out there, even on the NBC report that I read, addressing the number of boarding schools in the United States. And the NBC News story said, well, the boarding school era lasted from the early 19th century up until the 1990s, is how long I think they extended the history. And I think, well, that, it may be that there were institutions, and still are, right? Haskell still exists as an Indian college. Flandreau exists as a school, mostly, I think, dealing with children who have special needs at that particular school. But those institutions are very different from their 19th century predecessors. And so I would never consider boarding school era to extend into the 1990s, as the NBC News mentioned in their story that I read just this week. So it's very important, I think, for us, especially as American Indian people, to understand the boarding school era, understand what happened to different generations of our families who attended schools, and to have a kind of perspective on that and tell people that we know and educate our own children about this history, because it was a very important era in the history of the United States. But thinking about letters, I mentioned last week that my source for understanding the history of Indian education has been through American Indian letters. I sought them out. I was pleased to find them in the National Archives. And eventually I read hundreds and hundreds of letters from boarding school students, their family members. I read letters that superintendents wrote and corresponded with families. So I felt in a way that there was a kind of, I don't know what it is when you read letters. There's something very intimate about a letter. And especially what I liked about that as a historical source is letters they were never, we write a letter to an individual person usually, and there is a kind of intimacy about a letter that, and what I also like about it as a source for historians is that I think they're very honest and they're unpublished, right? And so, you know, if you're going to write a letter to the editor to the newspaper, as Lorena has done in the last year, she had a letter to the editor in the Bemidji Pioneer, we tend to, that's our public voice, right? We're expressing ourselves in a certain kind of way. But if you're writing a letter to your mother, a family member, that's very different than writing, you know, writing a public letter that's going to be published. Boarding school had newspapers that they published in their printing departments. And sometimes people have said, well, were the newspapers an important source for you in your writing about the boarding school era? And I read boarding school newspapers. Haskell had a really fine newspaper over the decades. But I felt like when students were writing a letter or writing a column or an essay for the Haskell newspaper, they were talking about assimilation is what we're headed toward. I want to be a citizen of the United States. And I didn't really think this was their private thoughts, right? I thought this was their public voice. And so I'm just going to read you a few very short excerpts of letters that I think illustrate something about the boarding school era. This was a letter written to Flandreau in 1917. In this case, it was from an Omaha parent. So it's from the Omaha agency in Nebraska. And this parent says, I can't remember if it was a man or mother or father, but they write, my son Thomas reported that you peoples tortured him like a slave, and he went without eat for 3 days. Punishment at hard labor, just like he was in a penitentiary. So, very strident, no mistaking what this person was writing. In this case, the parent was writing to the school, the person who ran the school. And he's saying, you know, I know what's going on, and I want you to do something about it, right? So you can see and understand what's behind this letter. This is a letter from the Leech Lake Reservation in Cass Lake that was written in, we have a Leech Laker here, written in 1924. And this is a father, I think, writing about his daughter. And he says, she hasn't been home for 3 years. And I am real anxious to have her here while we make maple sugar. So that's an Ojibwe parent's letter, isn't it? And there were a lot of letters like this that I found so moving, that parents were making compelling arguments as to why they should see their children. And often it was something like this that mattered to them. We know that ricing, making maple syrup, these kinds of activities are really important moments for Ojibwe parents to educate their children, right? This is an Ojibwe education. So of course they would want their child home to make maple sugar. But of course these requests in 1924, which was still the Assimilation era, were likely to be turned down because the superintendent had the authority to say, no, your daughter's going to stay here at the school with me for the rest of the school year. It will interrupt her term, her school year. And so it was generally the case that Indian children in these years spent 4 years at school. And boarding schools paid for your train trip to school, and they paid for your return visit 4 years later. And anything that happened in between was the parents had to raise the money. You know, it was not a big era of car travel in the 1920s, although there were some Indian families who had automobiles. And so it was mostly train travel. So a parent, you know, from northern Minnesota or Wisconsin or wherever, to get to Flandreau, that was a big distance in those days, and you had to take a train. So this is where the whole story that I was talking about last week of runaways came in, because boys in particular left the school in great numbers over the course of the year. By the end of the year, they wanted to go home and see their families, and they hopped on trains and they roamed the countryside like that student Victor I talked about. It was a little more difficult for girls to run away from school because they were more supervised. Boys could go into town, right? Even in, I don't know, growing up, I always complained that my older brother had more freedom than I had, but it was certainly the case in the early 20th century that girls were supervised, and the boarding school girls were very closely supervised. So they would not have been able to go into town without a chaperone, right? And so it was harder for them to run away from school. But the boys who had a little more freedom often just kind of left the premises. And I would suggest that those runaways were not just acts of resistance, they were a kind of form of resistance. But what they were more often about was simply staying in touch with their families, getting around the rules and regulations of boarding schools that did not work out for families. Parents were often very upset when their children ran away from school, and I read their letters, especially if their kids were, teenagers loose in the countryside somewhere. They're like, oh my gosh, I don't want anything to happen to my son. And so that was a source of conflict. Now, in the 1920s, a letter like this, we want my daughter to be home while we make maple sugar. That fell on deaf ears in the school, the boarding schools of the 1920s. In the 1930s, I suggested to you before that officials in the United States had changed their ideas about boarding school education, and they thought it was healthy for children to spend time with their families. And so in the 30s, children went and visited their families, or their families came to see them at school. But, I read so many letters where parents were saying someone in the family had passed away. They want their child to come home. Really tragic letters where a family member, even a mother, had terminal tuberculosis. And those requests were sometimes turned down by boarding school officials through the 1920s, the Assimilation era. And then things change in the 1930s, where there isn't this same kind of preoccupation with controlling Indian family life as had been the case for the previous decades. So things change. This is a letter. I had a chapter in Boarding School Seasons, which was just about the topic of homesickness. This is a letter from the Lakota Ray Reservation in Hayward in 1925. And this is a mother. I remember reading her sometimes more than one letter, right? You sometimes became familiar because you would have a series of letters from families. But she writes, "This makes my third letter to you in regard of my daughter, Margaret. If you would only know how I feel longing to see her. Please take my word. Send her home to me for a few weeks. You know it won't be long, school starts. Just to see her before she goes to school again. You know she will be gone a good 4 years." So a letter like that, I think it's very easy to understand what parents were going through. And also, I often think of the reservation system itself, but also the boarding school and the Assimilation era is a time when American Indian people, not just in boarding school, but also on the reservation, lost freedoms, right? And that there was an Indian agent or there was a superintendent who was trying to make decisions for your family, for your children. I've written in my grandfather's Knocking Sticks about how the Indian agent at Red Lake wrote about my grandmother's first 2 pregnancies, wanted her to go to the hospital, didn't want her this is after boarding school when she's in her 20s, didn't want her to give birth with her grandmother as midwife in Panema, wanted her to go to the hospital, right? And my grandmother, this is something I always thought was very cool, refused. She's like, no, I'm going to have my grandmother deliver my baby. That was my Aunt Amelia, her first daughter. And so, so that's the tension, I think, that we see with the reservation system and with boarding schools. There's a power that the federal government like to, in a way, hold over Indian people at that time. But there was also a constant negotiation with parents and Indian people on reservations and in boarding schools, because Indian people resisted the authority of boarding schools. They resisted the authority of the reservation system. So they were not complacent. And so we can never forget that. We can never, as harsh as the boarding school era is and the reservation system was for people like my own grandparents, we have to remember the agency of Native people, their resistance. We never want to underestimate. This is the word I always used writing my dissertation years ago. We never want to underestimate American Indian families, American Indian people, because what we see through this story is resistance. We see even young students in the context of the boarding school story being very rebellious at times under the strains of assimilation. Now, this is a letter in 1938 from the Red Lake Reservation. It was written by a mother named Isabella Strong. And she writes, and I'm kind of surprised because this is an era when parents had much more success getting their children home for visits in the summer and Christmas and that kind of thing. But she writes, "It seems it would be much easier to get her out of prison than out of your school." So penitentiary, prison, these were words that Indian families wrote in their correspondence. And then I'll give you one more quotation. "Hopefully, these regulations keep other Indian children, families, and tribes from suffering the heartbreak that we experienced over the last 5.5 years." So the first 4 quotations are selections from letters written by American Indian parents in the Midwest whose children attended government boarding schools in the early 20th century. The United States has a long history of family separation for Indigenous people and their children, one that gives context to more recent separations on the US-Mexico border, right? So we're still living in an era when the federal government separates family members. And that might seem shocking. A lot of the stories of the family separation were very shocking to Americans. People like to say, that's not what this country's all about. How can we be separating families at the border? Except American Indians are not surprised because that's our history, family separation. The logics of American settler colonialism prepared politicians and policymakers to rationalize that education was the only way for American Indians to progress from, as they put it at the time, paganism to civilization. Family separation then and now fed the aggressive goals of the nation state. In the 19th century, it was the desire for Indian land. Now, I was trying to emphasize very strongly last week that assimilation is not just about a humanitarian idea of the United States to uplift Indians and make them citizens of the United States. It was a desire for Indian land that began the boarding school era. But the intensity of letters from American Indian parents powerfully illustrate that going to school in ways that involve family separation was always painful, right? So you can't think about this era, the boarding school era, as being anything other than painful, as well as other forms of family separation, like the recent one that we have heard about going on the US-Mexico border. For boarding school students, even though they were promised, and their families were promised, you're going to be learn a trade, you're going to get a good job, you're going to enter American society, you're going to speak English, you're going to eventually become a citizen. What the boarding schools promised, and the reservation system, in the sense of superintendents being kind of accomplices in child removal at that time, but they said, you're going to get something from this, right? Indian families were promised something in return for sending their child away. But what Indian families learned was boarding school was not always a path to success, advancement, or even steady employment for many students. I always remember reading a superintendent at Red Lake in the 30s who was not like his predecessors. And as I have suggested, many times to you, the 30s is a different era. And the people who began managing reservations, working from the Bureau of Indian Affairs, were different kind of people, different ideas about cultural pluralism than their predecessors who were assimilationists. And I remember the superintendent at Red Lake in the 30s who referred to the boarding school students at Red Lake who had come back home as, he called them, a lost generation. And I never really took that idea too seriously, that they were a lost generation, because I think, I looked at people like my grandmother. She, got to work, having a family, she was a jingle dress dancer. So I think there were a lot of ways that her Ojibwe life and culture remained tremendously important to her. But what the superintendent at Red Lake meant, I think, when he said the lost generation, is that the Indian students who went away to boarding school were promised certain things, that they would get jobs, that they would enter American society on an equal footing as other Americans. And so Indian people come back to wherever, St. Paul, Minneapolis, Red Lake, Cass Lake, they come back to their home communities, and they find when they go to Bemidji or local off-reservation towns, they still can't find employment, right? Even though they can speak English, have trades, know how to do things, or have skills, job skills. But that economy is still closed off to American Indian people because of racism and prejudice. And so that's, I think, when I read more of what that superintendent at Red Lake was trying to say, I think that's what he was describing, the fact that people were not finding equality. They were not entering into jobs. They were not finding positions off the reservation where they could work, because there was still so much discrimination against American Indians. I was thinking a few years ago, we had done a really nice project where we interviewed, I'm glad we did it because many of them died so recently after, veterans of World War II. And we talked to like Burt Good at Red Lake, and we talked to other people from Minnesota who had been veterans, and many of them, commented on how difficult it was for them off the reservation. Burt Good talked about coming home from Red Lake after fighting in Patton's army, being awarded the Bronze Star. And he took the train from St. Paul up to, I think it was Thief River Falls, and found that his grandfather was in the hospital in Thief River Falls. So he's like, wow, he went to see his grandfather after coming home from World War II on the last day of his grandfather's life. And he just had this, ran into relatives in town, had this amazing experience. But after it was all over, he wanted to go out and have something to eat, have a beer, could not go into the bar because Indian people were not allowed, right? And he was with a friend of his, a white friend who was a veteran, who yelled and said, "This guy just came back from fighting in Europe and he can't come in and have a beer," So you're not going to get a job if you can't even come in and buy a beer in a local off-reservation town. So that's the situation, I don't think they're a lost generation, but maybe in some ways lost to the American, participating in American economic life, right? So poverty continued for Indian people. And they were promised things in the boarding school era. Parents were promised things. They wanted their kids to learn a trade, have a job skills, speak English. They did. But they were not always finding opportunity after boarding school. The metaphor American Indian families often resorted to regarding the boarding school experience, as you see from just these quotations, was incarceration, right? So that was sometimes how they viewed boarding schools. And especially it felt like incarceration if you couldn't bring your daughter home to make maple sugar, right? Things that Ojibwe people valued. Now, the last person I quoted, hopefully these regulations keep other Indian children, families, and tribes from suffering the heartbreak that we experienced over the last 5.5 years. The last person quoted is Dustin Brown, a Cherokee citizen and the biological father in one of the most stunning cases of child removal in recent times. It's remarkable. Some of you remember the news stories about this just a few years ago, but it's kind of remarkable because the case gained widespread media attention and it went to the Supreme Court, his case in 1913. But it's somewhat ordinary at the same time for the way it replicates generations of Indian child removals throughout American history. So the legacy of boarding school haunts Indigenous families today as new concerns arise regarding child removal as part of the welfare system. The history of American Indian child removal is a narrative about the authority of the American government over the sovereignty of Indian nations. But also, it's about adult authority in the face of child vulnerability. I always think it's a story against the boarding school era is a story about power, right? When it comes down to it, that here you have these bureaucrats in Washington designing this new system of Indian education, and then you have bureaucrats on the reservations, superintendents of schools, superintendents of Indian agencies who enforce this. That's the power, right? And so that's what Native people are struggling against. And then I think what makes it so sad to all of us today is the issue, the additional problem of child vulnerability, right? That it's not just the authority, right? Grown men, tribal chairmen, people fighting against this authority, hiring lawyers to fight this power, but it's children who are so vulnerable and become the pawns of this power in the boarding school era. But I believe that American settler colonialism did not end with the boarding school era, even though it may appear to be less harsh or less coercive than the policies of the 19th century. You can go on. Those are the letters that I just read. So back to the boarding school era. And I mentioned to folks last week that when you look at the history of Indian education through the lens of America's racial past, boarding schools are generally not considered as part of our legacy of segregated schooling. And for the most part, it's been a history largely ignored by US historians. And I think that's why the misinformation persists in the media, because they aren't getting good stories about the history of Indian education from the sources that they're using. but also it isn't a narrative that is well known to many non-Indian people. And that's why the shock, right, of hearing about residential schools in Canada, the shock has kind of emerged because it's an unfamiliar story. And then people have said, what? We had government boarding schools in the United States? At the time the schools were designed, reformers and politicians agreed that Indian men, women, children, but particularly children, must adopt values of individualism, become citizens, and pursue agricultural or industrial labor. So children have to change. Sometimes the rhetoric of the day was that it's too late to deal with the older generation of American Indians, but perhaps the children, we can have some success with children. This assessment of Indigenous societies was politically motivated, as I said, by the allotment of reservations and guided by the ongoing principle in American political and economic life of gaining greater control over Indian land and resources. And again, I think it's important for us all to remember that American Indians, like African Americans, were first taught to read and write in segregated schools, and that this system was upheld in the United States until the educational and political reforms of the 1930s began to lean toward public school integration for American Indians. So it's really that half century of Indian education when the power of segregation was so kind of uncompromising when it came to American Indian education and how families and children experienced education. But education was always upheld during that half century. This is going to be the compensation for impoverishment. Of course, they said you're going to benefit economically from getting rid of your allotted lands and your dispossession. But of course, we know that never happened. They promised citizenship. They promised Christianity, allowing Indians to transcend reservation life and integrate into American society and find employment. But as I've suggested to you, why segregate Indians if integration is really the goal? And I often ask my students at the university, why did the federal government create this elaborate off-reservation boarding school system for Indian children? And they always, they're up and they've read the rhetoric of the assimilation years, and they say, well, wasn't it about assimilating Indians into American society? And I always say, well, why not then everybody else? The Chinese, the Germans, the Italians, everyone, we wanted to speak English and extend, assimilate them into American life. But there's something unusual about American Indians and this kind of history of segregated schooling, because the system of boarding schools was exclusively for American Indians, right? Everybody else didn't need to be segregated except for African Americans. And so that's part of the story that we can't forget. You can see what else we have up here. These are just boarding school photos. The Haskell Band. Can assimilation alone account for the presence of Indian boarding schools for over half century in the United States? In the late 19th and early 20th century, the reality was that properties and assets were still at stake. And so a campaign for Indian land and resources was waged every single day of the boarding school era. So it's the history of the land grab rather than simply the rhetoric of assimilation that produced boarding schools. And this was one of the questions we dealt with last week, why Indian boarding schools? And so that was something we tried to answer. You can move on to the next one too. Perhaps my greatest, this is just a Flandreau photo of the girls in their baking class. But I think my greatest single realization, which I began to understand while writing about the remarkably important role of the Great Depression in shaping boarding school history, is that some of the differences in Indian experiences should be viewed as generational, which I also talked about last week. One reason that boarding school experiences varied widely for American Indian children and youth was that their lives, their ideas, their experiences were shaped by the times in which they attended school. This is very logical. And so even while we may have feel a strong kinship with our grandparents or our great-grandparents or our great-grandparents, right, who signed treaties, fought in wars, this kind of thing, it isn't really our experience, right? We have been shaped by different experiences. So I often think of Luther Standing Bear, who wrote a wonderful memoir of his life and his time at Carlisle. Sun Elk, the man from Taos Pueblo, who talked about what it was like to go away to Carlisle and be the first person from the Taos Pueblo to attend a government boarding school. And when he came home, he found out that he had missed out on his Pueblo education. He had a different kind of education. And it took him a few years to reintegrate into Pueblo society. Some of that was by taking part again in Pueblo ceremonial life, marrying a woman from the Taos Pueblo, but it took him a while. And of course, here in Minnesota, the great writer and thinker, Charles Eastman, the Dakota man who was a young child during the Dakota War, who escaped from the killing, the imprisonment, the exile of Dakota people here in Minnesota after the 1862 war. And he went off, Charles Eastman attended the Genoa boarding school in Nebraska before going to college in Beloit, Wisconsin, and then ending up at Dartmouth and actually going to medical school. But that generation, I've suggested to you, arriving for haircuts and uniforms at the end of the Indian Wars. Many of these people were Lakotas, Dakotas, Apaches, and they were from communities actively engaged in military resistance. Their experience was unique, but not entirely shared by later generations. This is just a picture of the baseball team when you look at the boarding schools, just like probably our high school yearbooks, there are a lot of pictures of sports, right? The sports teams and such. So you see a lot of those when you go look in the, mostly at state historical societies where you find photographs of the boarding schools, not so much the National Archives, which tend to not keep really good photographs. And for that, you have to go into, some of you know, the Library of Congress in DC. Subsequent generations of students often had already attended a mission-a-day school, were bilingual, or were from families who already worked in the wage economy. Makers of a new world in education, the early Carlisle and Haskell generation attended school at the height of the Assimilation campaign and the end of this military conflict. Recently, I've become very intrigued by the American Indian generation who lived through World War I and survived the influenza epidemic of 1918-19, which was, I think, the World War I generation in some ways, critical ways, exceptional. So I often think this photograph on the right is kind of illustrative of the World War I generation. I mentioned to you last week that the global epidemic of influenza that hit many boarding schools contribute to illness and high rates of death. And this was a traumatic time in Indian boarding schools for survivors, and especially at the Haskell School where things got very rough during that era. But this photograph on the right is a group of people. It took me a while to figure out who some of them were when I came across this photograph the first time. But they were members of the Society of American Indians. And they were a group that formed first in 1911, and many of them were former members or former students of federal boarding schools. So they'd had educations. Some of them were people like Charles Eastman, who had gone on to college. And this generation were very outspoken leaders in their communities, but many of them also became national leaders about Native American issues. And so in here, there's some of them we always talk about, historians anyway. We talk about the famous people who were members of the Society of American Indians, who include Charles Eastman, Carlos Montezuma, the Yavapai doctor from Arizona, Gertrude Simmons Bonin, also known as Zit-Kala-Shah, the Yankton Dakota woman. They were, Zit-Kala-Shah, Gertrude Bonin wrote for magazines in New York, right? She talked about Indian issues for the Atlantic, magazines like that. And they had a very public audience for their work, right? Charles Eastman published books about his childhood and on many different topics. And they talked about assimilation, citizenship. And so I think it's very important to remember that World War I. Not all of them went into the war, but I just think they're people who lived through that era. I have a colleague named John Troutman, who I'm a real fan of because he writes great books, interesting books about Indian people, especially books that look at popular culture. But he wrote a few years ago a book called Indian Blues, American Indians and the Politics of Music. And he suggests that this World War I generation produced a different set of tactics, strategies, and ideas that were very different from the first Carlisle graduates. So think of them as kind of a reform group who used public forums like magazines, books, newspapers to lobby for Indian issues. So we've had Indian organizations for a long time, right? But in the 19th century, the Indian organizations were non-Indians talking about allotment, assimilation. But this is the first really major group of Indian people. And I'm suggesting to you too, Carlos Montezuma, Charles Eastman, Gertrude Bonin, they were tribally diverse. They were from all different parts of the country, and they were informed and interested in Native issues, spoke about it, lobbied, and they met on a regular basis. Some of the lesser known Society of American Indian People, not as famous as Gertrude Bonin and Charles Eastman or Carlos Montezuma, but Mr. Caswell from Red Lake, I think his name was Louis Caswell. We knew a Louis Caswell of his son, but he was a member of the Society of American Indians. He might even be in this picture. And so he was one of the founding members of the Society of American Indians. There were Ho-Chunk people, Ojibwe people, many American Indians who'd been to federal boarding schools, who were founders of the Society of American Indians, who worked and lobbied on Native issues in the early 20th century. Troutman, my colleague, views this group of self-consciously modern American Indians as folks who were, quote, creating new traditions while publicly asserting that Indians must, quote, claim a voice and leadership in their own affairs. The World War I generation, and I'm not just talking about the SAI folks, was also the first to enlist directly into the military from government boarding schools, beginning a new trend in Indian patriotism directly related to American colonialism inherent in the boarding school system. So I think I mentioned to you last week that volunteer rates into the military were higher in World War I from federal boarding schools than reservations, making boarding schools graduates the most likely Indians to fight under the American flag in the First World War. The changing times of World War I directly influenced the experience of students as well as returned students who employed, as did the Society of American Indians, the language of citizenship to advance Indian rights and cultural pluralism. So the older generation of people in Washington, right, the bureaucrats who started the Indian schools, cultural assimilation. But these people are saying, we need rights. We're Americans. We should be citizens of the United States, right? And remember that complex story of citizenship with American Indians, that some people became citizens on an individual basis as they took allotments, right? And so, I don't know, my grandpa Aganash, I wonder, he was the one from Mille Lacs, but he took an allotment at White Earth, but he spoke just Ojibwe. And I was not really, I think he probably became a citizen of the United States with the taking of his allotment at White Earth in the teens, which was the time that he did that. But my grandmother, Jeanette, on Red Lake, we never allotted our reservation. We're Red Lakers, citizens of the United States before the Snyder Act in 1924. Probably not very many Red Lakers were U.S. citizens until the 1920s. So I also suggest to you then, the Indian Wars generation, this World War I generation, and some of them were very, one of my favorite books is this book called Making Indian Law. And it's about a Wallapai man in Arizona who came back from the First World War and began asking a lot of questions about land issues on the Wallapai Reservation in Arizona. And I think he's just so illustrative of this generation. And I often think of, Vine Deloria's quotation from Custer, who talks about the generation of American Indian leaders who sat reading, well, this is a little bit later, more like the 40s, sat reading Cohen's Handbook of Federal Indian Law by the Kerosene Lands, right, that everybody had at that time. That there are a lot of people who became outspoken about Native issues, but some of them were this interesting World War I generation. A new era in Indian education commenced once public school education surpassed boarding schools as the foundation of U.S. Indian education, which happened, I can't emphasize this enough, in the 1930s, right? The 1990s, the 1980s, the 1970s is not the boarding school era, even though we had some boarding schools. The smaller number of boarding schools that remained in the 1930s, because the federal government started shutting them down in the 1930s. Under FDR and John Collier, they closed many boarding schools. Those that existed primarily were there to offset the poverty of Indian families during the Great Depression, when Indian demand for the schools was so widespread that it was the decade of highest enrollment. So imagine the federal government is closing down boarding schools. Indians are writing to superintendents and to the schools saying, can you take my children? I'm having a hard time. I'm unemployed. And this becomes the decade of high enrollment, not at the insistence of the federal government, who are over boarding schools by the 1930s and advocate public schools, but at the request of Indian families. The 1930s is the decade of highest enrollment. So that experience, that Great Depression generation, is somewhat unique as well, right? Boarding schools, there was, I think, a unique quality to the Great Depression generation. Forced into boarding schools, but really forced there to offset the poverty of their families during the bleakest economic time of the 20th century. So that's a generation. Among American Indians today, who often single out boarding school as the institution most responsible for creating societal problems for later generations, there isn't a strong historical memory of the notion that Indian people themselves repeatedly sought out schools for their children as a strategy of, I would say, family preservation, right? You're trying to keep your family together during the Great Depression. And so people, men and women, seek out boarding schools for their children, not because they love boarding school, but because they want to make sure that their children's needs are met when they're going through this incredibly hard time. Indian people were some of the first to be unemployed in the Great Lakes. So it's interesting then to see how families and students put kind of limits on the now declining assimilative intentions of the institution. And again, we don't want to underestimate American families because it shows how they shaped and defined the boarding school era, just as the federal government and policymakers, but students and families also shape and define the boarding school era. Now, a few years ago, just a couple years ago, right before the pandemic, I think this is one of my last, I went and spoke before an education conference of people who didn't necessarily know very much about American Indians. And I think the meeting, I'm trying to think of what they were. They were a lot of people of diverse backgrounds, minorities, who were administrators in universities and colleges. In fact, I was invited by my friend and colleague, Frank Hernandez, who is a dean of a big school in Texas. And so there were a lot of people of diverse backgrounds, educators there, very prominent people, but very few American Indians, and they didn't know much about American Indian education and its history. So they invited me, but it was in New Orleans, and I always love to go to New Orleans. And so I talked a little bit about the history of Indian education in New Orleans or Louisiana when I was down there. And I am not an expert on this topic, but fortunately for me, I had a wonderful graduate student who came to the University of Minnesota to get his PhD, and he was Louisiana Choctaw. And he wanted to study federal recognition issues in Louisiana. And he went down to study tribes that had been recognized, tribes that were still struggling for recognition, and one that had been turned down, right? So he's trying to look at Louisiana Choctaw history. And when he went down and did his field work in Louisiana, he ran into a really interesting story from my perspective on Indian education in the United States, that one that we sometimes take for granted or exclude. And that is, he found that when he looked at the different Choctaw communities, their story of Indian education was not boarding school. Their story was a struggle to go to school at all in rural Louisiana. So we also don't want to make the mistake of thinking that all Indians in the United States had the same history as maybe Dakota Ojibwe people in Minnesota, who were federally recognized and had this long relationship. So Native scholars, Brian, my former student, Brian Klopotek, and a good colleague of mine at North Carolina, who's now moving to Emory University, Melinda Maynor Lowry, Brian, who's Choctaw, Melinda, who is Lumbee from North Carolina, have talked about how Indian education under Jim Crow reveals the complexity of Indian history in the US, especially for those Indian people with Indian and African heritage in the segregated South, right? That's the history of many Indians in the southeastern part of the United States and eastern tribes like the Lumbee. They have Indian heritage. They often have African heritage as well. So what Lowry and Klopotek have said is that for Choctaw, Lumbee people, and other non-federally recognized tribes in particular, their story of education unfolded in ways that may not have included federal boarding school at all, right? So we can't say all Indians, this was a policy, right? Because many non-federally recognized Indians, not under the purview of the federal government, some of them who've tried to get recognition in the 20th century, never went to government boarding schools. So in particular in Louisiana, the most common story for Choctaw people was a struggle for schooling. And so what he found in rural Louisiana is that Indians were not, they could have gone to Black schools. And they sometimes felt, not to be, to think of it in the most negative terms, but they felt they would be further marginalized in the South if they attended Black schools. And so some of them did not go to school until the 1960s in rural Louisiana. So no boarding school, right? This isn't their history of non-federally recognized Indians in the United States. So the story of struggling to go to school at all is more their history. So just to kind of end up on, to go beyond the Great Generation, just to kind of mess up this history that we want to neatly package, right? We want to say, this is what happened with Indians. And I'll say, oh my gosh, unless you're not federally recognized, or if you went to school, in the 30s or that kind of thing. Indigenous scholars and social workers refer to the 1940s, the time directly following the boarding school period, when I'm suggesting to you, Indians are now mostly in public school in the United States. This is the beginning of the adoption era for American Indian children. The largely Euro-American employees of social service agencies sought solutions to complex problems, including mental illness, alcoholism, family violence, by removing children not only from the troubled parents, but from the Indian community entirely, permanently. We know that happened. We know that very well in Minnesota, that this is also part of the story of tribal, child removal. For it doesn't end with boarding schools. For one reservation in Minnesota, White Earth, 25% of White Earth children left the reservation for foster and adoptive homes in the post-war era. Alarmingly high statistics of child removal existed in not just Minnesota, but South Dakota and other states with significant Indian populations. In one extremely successful political movement that we're very proud of in Minnesota, women active in the urban community of Minneapolis-St. Paul paved the way for groundbreaking legislation in the continuing struggle against family separation in the form of the Indian Child Welfare Act of 1978. The act recognized Indian political sovereignty in the self-determination era and protected the interests of families and tribal nations, quote, to establish standards for placement of Indian children in foster or adoptive homes to prevent the breakup of Indian families, while also, of course, promoting tribal jurisdiction over child custody proceedings. For the first time since the boarding school era, and in a turning point for U.S.-Indian relations, tribes resumed sovereignty over their own relatives and children. The federal law had, as we know here, a profound effect on stabilizing Indian families, since it gave preference to Indian families in foster care and adoption proceedings. Foster care and adoption with tribes in control would allow children to maintain their identity as well as religious practices and social life. Tribal nations have regarded ICWA as one of the most significant pieces of legislation to come out of the self-determination era. We know that local and state courts have at times disregarded terms of the Indian Child Welfare Act, whether through ignorance of the federal law or in an effort to assert their own power and authority. And I just want to mention in conclusion, back to that quote, and go on to the next slide. What do I have here? Okay. A big case about child removal eventually landed at the US Supreme Court with adoptive couple versus baby girl. And this is what I'm going to conclude with. The plight of unwed fathers in Indian country is generally not a burning social issue for most Americans, yet an ordinary case involving a Cherokee father who was an active member of the military became the source of tremendous public and media attention and eventually landed the Supreme Court in 2013. Like most stories involving young couples, babies, and adoption, there is a certain amount of heartbreak and anguish. And so it is with this case. Dustin Brown, a citizen of the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma, was a soldier in the U.S. Army and was a few days away from being deployed to Iraq when he was informed that his infant daughter, Veronica, was being adopted. Brown was estranged from his former non-Indian fiancée, Veronica's birth mother, and she was the one who had decided to put their baby up for adoption while she was pregnant, and she never informed Brown of her plans. Soon after she was born, Veronica went to live with a white couple from South Carolina who subsequently filed a petition for adoption. The father, Mr. Brown, was awaiting his deployment and was served with adoption papers when his daughter was 4 months old and already living in South Carolina. Brown had thought his daughter was living with her mother and was unaware that she had been taken from the state of Oklahoma. So a series of bureaucratic mishandlings and mishaps ensued. Brown was an active member of the military, and he had no choice but to leave for Iraq, where he served in the U.S. Army the next year. In what must have been an agonizing departure, he left for Iraq without knowing his daughter's future. As deeply troubled as this case was from the beginning, it would worsen on its way to the U.S. Supreme Court. Dustin Brown, the soldier in Iraq, lost a fundamental right all parents possessed when his daughter went to live permanently with a new family, one Brown did not even know. Without informing the father or the Cherokee Nation, the couple took the baby with them to their residence in South Carolina. The case resonated for tribal people and their nations across the United States who had struggled since the boarding school era against the removal of their children. But what makes this case more than a custody dispute is the sovereignty of tribal nations over their citizens. Of course, Indigenous sovereignty predates the formation of the United States, and laws like ICWA have been yet still extremely necessary and helpful. The case grew complicated in ways that involve both race and gender. South Carolina, where Veronica resided with a white family who hoped to adopt her, puts limits on the rights of unwed fathers. So, interestingly though, the courts in South Carolina upheld the terms of the Indian Child Welfare Act. They recognized that ICWA applied in this case to children who are members of a federally recognized tribe or eligible for membership, and the biological child of a tribal member. In 2011, Dustin Brown, Cherokee citizen, military veteran, and father, assumed custody of his daughter because of ICWA. By then, she was a 2-year-old toddler. So Veronica came back to her family and tribal nation in Oklahoma, where she remained for the next 2 years. When the adoptive couple petitioned the case further, a disturbing decision emerged from the U.S. Supreme Court regarding adoptive couple versus baby girl. In June 2013, and many of us were aware of this decision, in a stunning 5-4 decision at odds with the federal legislation of the Indian Child Welfare Act, the court held that a non-custodial father did not hold rights under ICWA. That's the Supreme Court. So despite the legal intervention of his tribe, and the tribe was very involved in this case, it wasn't him alone. Despite the legal intervention of the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma, the courts finalized the adoption in South Carolina. The Oklahoma Supreme Court almost immediately prohibited the decision as the child was residing with her father in Oklahoma. Nonetheless, the South Carolina couple in 23, after this Supreme Court decision, assumed custody of the girl and legally adopted her after her 4th birthday, despite her father's heart-rending objections and the deep legal opposition of the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma. So that's the 4th quotation that I began with from Dustin Brown. Hopefully these regulations keep other Indian children, families, and tribes from suffering the heartbreak that we experienced over the last 5.5 years. So the Indian Child Welfare Act of 1978 was a landmark, but in spite of the success of ICWA in placing Indian children or children with Indian families and in culturally appropriate homes, its legal future has never been secure, right? Most troubling of all, the law has been at times dismissed by authorities at the state and local level. States including South Dakota can be especially recalcitrant. So the case adoptive couple versus baby girl illustrates that tribal nations must continue, as they have in many ways since the boarding school era, to struggle for the sovereignty over their youngest citizens. I can't remember, I think there's something else, but I don't know what it is. Read that book if you haven't already. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Dr. Child. And now, love to hear your questions, comments, anything. We'll start. Does anyone have any questions here in the room? Anyone?
And you should answer them since you have the podium.
You don't want me to answer. Also, if you're watching us online, you can post your comments or questions in the chat, and we'll have them post up here so Dr. Child can answer them. So, and if you're in our overflow room, there is a camera in there too that you can approach to ask questions as well. So, with no questions are here, I guess we'll go to the first question online.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So when I was writing boarding school seasons or working on my project years ago, as I mentioned last week, my grandmother was very influential because she was the one, since I was a girl, who told me about boarding schools. I'd never heard of them until her. So I did talk to people more on an informal basis about their experience of boarding school because my grandmother had cousins. There were other people from Red Lake who had gone to boarding school. And so I talked to them, and they were very important to me in developing questions and forming some of my ideas about boarding school. But I will say that, and some of this has to do with disciplinary training. So I'm a historian, and historians love archives and documents, and we tend to pursue our research. And I, as I was suggesting last week and in the writing of boarding school seasons, you can see that I relied on a lot of letters that American Indian families wrote during this era. And I kind of believed that, as I started my comments, I think I point out why I thought letters were so valuable. But I always encourage my students to read other work in the history of Indian education. I love the memoirs, especially of the early 20th century when most of them were published. Even Charles Eastman's early work was published 1910, that kind of era. And he talks about his experience at school, as do many Indian writers in the United States from the early 20th century. There are Pueblo people and others who have written their life stories and included something about boarding school. But in addition to those voices, I like to encourage people to read my good colleague's book. Chanina Lomawema is a Muskogee Creek scholar, and her dad was a student at the Chilocco Indian School in Oklahoma. And Chanina was trained as an anthropologist, and the anthropologists go out and do life histories and interviews and that sort of thing. So she interviewed many people. She was doing, we weren't known to one another in grad school. She was off doing her work at Stanford. I was in the Midwest, but she was interviewing former boarding school students who had gone to Chilocco. And so I think these books complement one another because she was able to really get at the students' life in the school story. Because, you know, if any of us would tell our story of school, any of us wrote our educational biographies, we would talk about our friends, the crazy things we did in school, the years of, you know, coming of age, or who Lorena dated in high school, or these stories that all come up with when we look back on our educational biographies. And that's the way her book is. So her book, it's called, they called it Prairie Light, the story of Chilocco Indian School, is very good at oral histories and students telling their own stories. But as we always say, my book kind of gets at the family story better, because there was, with those letters, a way of telling what was going on at the time, right? It's not just what we remember as an older person reflecting on our experience of school many decades earlier, but with the letters, I could kind of see what was going on, and I could see the family ties that persisted throughout the boarding school era. And so I really think that it's great to pair some of this work, because many of us have, you know, tried to study, Indigenous scholars have tried to study this era, and we've had different results that complicate and complement one another. And also, I always like to say, if you have time, go down to the Heard Museum and see our exhibit, Away from Home, American Indian Boarding School Stories, which Chanina and I both worked on. So that's the answer to that. Do you have another one, or? Yay.
Just yell.
Mm-hmm. Yell your question down the hall. Can she come over and ask it?
Yeah, I'll just do that, yeah. Just right next to them.
We're getting our question from next door.
We want to speak up those. Yeah, just ask it right here.
I want to know why you're only talking on the TV about just only the good aspects of school, like the 11 that were, you know, sophisticated and everything and went on.
Mm-hmm.
But you're not talking about all the horrors and everything that actually really happened in these schools.
Okay.
That, like South Dakota selling their babies for $10 a piece, the nuns in the churches and everything.
Yeah, so what I chose to do with my research is not talk about the Catholic and the mission schools, which I've never studied and claim no real knowledge of. So I think there's a lot of work to be done with mission school history. And my work has just been about the off-reservation federal boarding schools. And if you look at boarding school seasons, and I talked about some of these issues last week, I talk about the decisions, how Indian children ended up in boarding school, what was going on with their families at the time. I try to let Native people tell their stories. I wasn't trying to sort out letters of happy people who loved boarding school. And there were people who liked boarding school. So I didn't try to ignore it entirely. But I also have a chapter in the book called Homesickness, which deals with the emotional story of boarding schools, of how hard family separation was on Indian families. So, and then the other chapter that was very hard to do research on was about the students who died at school. So we addressed some of those issues last week, and they're on the Zoom that you can watch. There's a recording of last week's conversation. And then it's also, you could also look at Boarding School Seasons, which is widely available, not very expensive in paperback, to learn more about the students who died at school.
Right, because I've been following all the Canada stuff.
Right.
And Canada learned from the United States all the horror and crap that went on
Yeah.
in the boarding schools, and they learned it from them, and they did it up in Canada, and they're still doing it up there.
Yeah, so also last week, we talked a little bit about the differences in Indian education between Canada and the United States. And one of the big differences was in Canada, the churches, the federal government paid churches to organize and run boarding schools. And that wasn't the case in the United States. And the other big difference, as I see it, is that boarding schools, so we kind of moved to public schools for Indians in the US in the 1930s, and Canada did not. They continued residential schools for another 50 years, mostly operated by the Catholic Church. 70% of them were run by the Catholic Church. So people that are, our age generation went to residential school in Canada, whereas even my own mother went to public school at Red Lake, right? Went to contract school on the reservation. And so people who went to those schools are around, we know from those Truth and Reconciliation hearings and all the testimony and the work that was done in Canada, people were around to tell their stories, right? But it seems that the church organizations that ran boarding schools, children did not fare as well in Canada.
Well, they beat them here too. I mean, they did it. They weren't all nice here either. I mean, I got relatives that all the Catholic schools were torture.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And I just have never studied the Catholic schools myself, so I have to rely on other people and hopefully people doing that now to do that research.
Okay, so,
Yeah.
So when you start talking about all your knowing of, all the good stuff in the schools, you should bring up that you don't, you haven't learned of that part of your aspects.
Yeah, and I do tell, this is just what I'm studying, and I always insist that I study federal off-reservation boarding schools, and I've devoted a lot of my life and career to try to talk about the history of Indian education and the problems with it, especially in the late 19th and early 20th century, because it's in my own family story as well. But I appreciate your comments. And I think there is a lot we need to know about other institutions that educated Indians.
Yeah, because when they start searching the schools here like they are in Canada, I mean, there's gonna be a big uproar to start. It's gonna be crazy.
Yeah.
I think.
Okay.
Thank you.
You muted me. Oh, great. So I'm not sure. So if we're talking about the question asked are there books on this subject? Of course, I recommend, if you're interested in the history of Indian education, to read Boarding School Seasons. Those are my thoughts. Chanina Loma-Wema's wonderful book, they called it Prairie Light. If you want a big overview, there's a great book called Education for Extinction by David Wallace Adams. And then I love Native people telling their own stories, right? So I think Charles Eastman's wonderful biographies that he wrote, autobiographies, life histories of his, From the Deep Woods to Civilization, is one of my favorite books. I teach it again and again and again and again with my various classes at the University of Minnesota. So there are other Native people who were around in the assimilation era who wrote what their experiences were. So I think that's a good those are some really good starting places. And I know it's where I started. The consequences of running away from school. The important thing to remember about schools, and I was not of a generation to experience this, but corporal punishment was kind of standard in not just boarding schools, but American schools of the late 19th and the early 20th century. We have very different ideas now that we shouldn't beat children, discipline through violence is not the way to teach children to correct their behavior. But for most of the boarding school era, and I'm thinking of that half century, many of you are probably as well as aware as I am that corporal punishment was standard in schools and in Indian boarding schools of that time. And so there came to be a time, and I'd have to look at my book again because I wrote about this, when corporal punishment was outlawed in the federal schools. So there was a conversation about this taking place on Indian experts and their national conferences. You know, should we use corporal punishment or not? It was a conversation. And so that was part of the boarding school conversation. But there were also jails on the premises of some of the boarding schools. I was just out a couple years ago looking at the grounds of the old Phoenix Indian School, which is right off Central Avenue in Central Phoenix. And that was a boarding school for many, many years. And you can go through that building. They're trying to turn it into save and restore the building, which are very beautiful. In fact, some of the buildings are kind of Spanish, colonial, old Southwest, gorgeous buildings. And they're involved in trying to save those historic buildings and also tell the history of the Phoenix Indian School. And so that's one of the institutions that I've gone through with my friend out there who's Hopi, and she tries to educate people about the history of the school at the Phoenix Indian School. They had a jail. Haskell and Flandreau had jails on campuses. So if you ran away from school, and again, I told you this is more likely to be what happened with boys, that they could be incarcerated on the school campus in a jail. Okay. So now, are we on our last question? Because I think we're supposed to wrap up about 7:30, but I'll just address this last question. So did boarding schools have year-round classes? Did the schedule change in summer? And this is a really fantastic and important question, because part of the boarding school program that Pratt, Lieutenant Colonel Pratt at the Carlisle School, who designed, was the outing program. And so the idea of boarding schools is that you not send kids home in the summer, but instead that that kids would not return home for their 4-year term, but instead they would stay at the school. And so what Pratt designed is the outing program, and kids would get jobs during the summer. And the idea at that time is that Indians were good with their hands. They were going to become manual laborers. They're going to be second-class citizens. And so, in fact, Pratt wasn't even the worst person when it came to this. He had some aspirations for Indians, but he did design this outing program where kids would go work in the summer months. A lot of kids worked in for local white farmers. And so that was what happened during the, he's putting a lot of signs up for me to read in the back of the room, so it's making me lose my train of thought. But Yeah, so the outing program was a really important part of boarding school history. Not everybody went and worked on a farm. My grandmother, the girls usually worked as domestic servants. And I have a chapter in boarding school seasons called Working for the School, which talks about not just the curriculum, but the outing program as well. And in this era, girls often went to households where there were young children. And so I always think about how middle-class families wanted domestic servants because they had a lot of child laundry, right? And we know what that meant in the diaper era. And so boarding school girls often worked in households with young children. My grandmother was the first one to tell me about working as a domestic servant around, when she was in South Dakota. So as much as we emphasize that students did find farm labor, which was very typical around Carlisle, Pennsylvania at the turn of the century, where Indians went to school, there were other stories that Indian people, even at Red Lake, told me about what they did on the outing program. And do you remember Dan Needham, Lorena, from Red Lake, who was in his 90s when I talked to him when I was finishing up my research. Now, I hadn't written boarding school seasons yet, but he was in his 90s, and he was at that time the oldest person at Red Lake who had gone to Carlisle. And he said he worked as a waiter in Atlantic City during the outing program in the summer. So just when you think you understand everything about the boarding school era, it was strictly agricultural labor and girls did this and that sort of thing, someone had a very different kind of experience. So I think he liked his work in Atlantic City, thought it was a lot of fun. So I just said that I would take the last question, and that was, but I actually will address this one as my final question because I know Dan said he wanted us to finish up at 7:30 tonight and not go until 8. He told me 7:30, so I'm just gonna go take one more question. So the question is, I'm curious about the young females. Were they also in boarding school? Were their experience similar to the males, and how were their lives after they returned home? Yeah, so boarding school girls, as I'm kind of suggesting to you, they participated as well in the outing program. They could also be very resistant as boarding school students, even though they were not successful runaways as often as boarding school boys because of the nature of their supervision. I always remember there was a young woman at Flandreau, Mary Bad Boy, who had the runaway record of the year, right? So as soon as you say this is what it was like for girls, there are always exceptions to the story. I think that girls were, and this is where Chanina Lomawema's book is really good. She talks a lot about the education for domesticity. And here in Minnesota, Roger Buffalo Head and Paulette Fairbanks wrote a nice article that made its way. We have a book that goes along with the exhibit at the Heard Museum in Phoenix. And it talks about how there was they talked about the married student program. So the Hampton Institute, which most of us think of as an institution for educating African Americans, also had Indian students in the kind of early era of boarding schools when Carlisle was first being established. And they had a program for girls, young couples, because what people had in mind during the assimilation years is that Native people would find their life partner in boarding school and then go home and marry them and have an Indian family that would be a good example to the rest of the community, and so forth. So that was another aspect of boarding school life where domesticity was really emphasized, and in particular the kind of training that people expected in the Victorian era for girls, which was very different from how Native women and Ojibwe women, of course, lived in their own communities, where women in our communities here in the Great Lakes, tended to control a lot of the economy. They were very active in working in the wild rice economy. And that kind of labor was thought of as being men's work by boarding schools. And women were discouraged from doing agricultural labor or what was regarded as men's labor. And so it was strictly for girls and education for domesticity, right, under 19th and early 20th century ideas. So, okay, well, thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Child. Let's give another big hand for Dr. Child. And before we have you come and do final closing remarks, I have a couple of housekeeping items that I have to take care of here. First of all, I want to thank our team from the college who put together and got the tech all taken care of. Did a great job as usual, and our team back at the studio who is taking care of everything. Great job. I'd like to thank the staff of the Red Lake Nation Embassy for helping us out and giving us this wonderful place to hold this presentation. And I also want to thank you who are watching online. This is something that we're going to be doing a lot more of throughout the rest of the year. We'll be doing these presentations and reaching out to you and trying to hit topics that are of interest to you and to the community. Your feedback is very important to us. So please, when you're looking in the chat, just give us a comment on how we did, 1 to 5, 5 being super great, best ever, 1 being we don't want to see a 1. But if to let us know what we could do to make it better. And any other comments as well. For those of you we didn't get to the questions, we're going to try to get them answered later. And then a couple other housekeeping and remarks. Here at the Red Lake Nation Embassy, where Red Lake Nation College is offering classes, we will actually be having an open house on July 28th and 29th here at the embassy. So stop by, say hi, register for classes. You can register online right now. We also have online classes, so you don't even have to be in Minnesota, in Minneapolis, or at Red Lake. You can register anywhere. So go to our website and begin the registration process, and we'll get in contact with you. And you can register for classes right now. Fall semester's just around the corner, so register now. And then the other thing is, as I mentioned, we are going to do other presentations. We do have our next presentation scheduled on August 11th. James Vukolich, who runs a popular Facebook Live Ojibwe Word of the Day, is going to be speaking on the 7 Ojibwe grandfather teachings. And it'll be 6 to 8, just like this program. And so make sure that you're there for our next event. And yes, that's it. Got all my housekeeping out of the way. And with that, I'd like to ask Dr. Child to give us some closing remarks. And thank you. Thank you very much.
So I guess my closing remarks would be sort of what I started with, and that it's very important for us as Native people to understand the history of federal boarding schools in the United States, especially because so many of our own families were affected by this experience. As we go on in time, we perhaps are not as close to the generations who attended federal boarding schools, who by this time have not mostly passed on, right? So if we think about this half century when Indian education was dominated by the federal boarding schools, that is maybe becoming for us kind of a very distant era. But in thinking about it, I find it very useful, as I was talking about tonight, to think about the idea of generations, that you have the generations who experienced and lived through the Indian Wars. So where I'm from at Red Lake, we may not have been involved in military conflict with the United States, but it was still a threat at the time, right? That was something, we were very aware of the Dakota War taking place in southern Minnesota. So these were very dangerous times that Native people lived in when the reservation system was first being established. After that, I've been encouraging you to think about the World War I generation as having a very distinctive experience because of their experience either going off to war, serving in the military, or being educated in a federal school, or perhaps going on to higher education, as some of them did, who formed this really important organization called the Society of American Indians, who tended to look at Native issues and write and speak out about Native issues in a different way than the assimilationists who worked in Washington. Most of them were very interested in the citizenship question, which was still pressing in the early 20th century. After that, I would also suggest to you that the Great Depression was a very important moment in the lives of American Indians in the Great Lakes, who had in many ways many of them lost access to traditional territories. The wild rice economy was changing very much at that time. Some American Indians had moved into wage labor and then were among the first to be impoverished and unemployed during the Great Depression. And ironically, the 1930s, when the government is no longer promoting boarding schools, this is the decade of highest enrollment of American Indian students. So I also brought into the conversation tonight the generation, of more recent years, the importance of the Indian Child Welfare Act, but the fact that family separation, whether through issues related to social work and child removal, has also been a part of our experience, especially in the second half of the 20th century. And it's one that's really still with us today when we see that we have to always be vigilant about these issues as American Indian people. The Supreme Court, we feel, made a very terrible decision in 2013 involving the removal of a child from her American Indian father and her tribe. And that shows that we are still vulnerable despite the success of the work of the Indian Child Welfare Act. What we've seen on the US-Mexico border is that this is not an issue just of, an era gone by, that we still remove, in some cases, Indigenous people from their families on the US-Mexico border. So rather than saying this is an aberration in the history of the United States, it appears to me to be much more of a pattern. So thank you very much.